Michael Grosso is part of an ever-growing group of scholars and thinkers who are critical of the prevailing materialistic view of the world. He's taught philosophy and humanities, and has written a number of books related to consciousness and parapsychology. We discussed macro-psychokinesis, the darker side of psychical research, and the UFO phenomenon, and talked in depth about the research that went into his book, The Man Who Could Fly, St. Joseph of Copertino, and the Mystery of Levitation. Timestamps are in the description, and we hope you enjoy the episode. So, Michael, to start us off, can you please talk a little bit about your background and about your main areas of research interest?
Well, I am a trained philosopher at Columbia University. I got my degree. And before I got that degree, I was into classical Greek. And also throughout my life, I've basically been a painter, but I've not made it a career, but it relates to my imagination. At any rate, in the course of my getting a PhD, I had conversations with fellow students, and I remember one day I mentioned the fact that I had an ESP experience.
Right.
And he looked at me, my buddy, and he said, "But that's impossible. It would imply dualism. In short, it would imply the reality of the mind." So I said, well, so much the better, because I had the experience and I have full belief in the mind. So already in graduate school, I was turned on to becoming more alert to phenomena that I knew many of my fellow students and teachers were, for some historical reasons, opposed to.
Yeah.
So when I got my degree, oddly enough, 5 days before I got my actually full degree, I had one of the strangest experiences of my life, in which I was with my girlfriend, and we both, and plus a guy on the roof, witnessed a UFO out there dancing in unison with the music that we were listening to, namely John Coltrane's The Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. I don't know if you know John Coltrane, but wild jazz player. And there were, I won't recount the entire story, but it made quite an impression on me. And it left me with an idea. So, how this happened, I don't know. It's a complete mystery. It still is. But I got the impression I was getting a message from the universe. You're about to become a doctor and wise. Figure this one out, buddy. That was the message I almost got. But there was also a connection with music. Because, Coltrane is not, a priest, but he was interested in the spiritual dimension of music. So that was, again, a powerful reminder of this whole area, because not only was the paranormal forbidden, in those days, you don't talk about UFOs unless you want to be accused of being a nut or a clown or something. And of course, now, since 2017, things are quite different. Now the government is saying, come on and tell us your stories.
Yeah. So
I would say this is the beginnings of my interest in the nature of mind. I spent many years teaching humanities, where I taught courses in philosophy and also in the history of culture. So I was always thinking about the big picture of the origins of humanity and the future of humanity.
Yeah. And
my research into the paranormal has led me to the belief that these phenomena represent evolutionary aspects of our potential future. And how that full realization will ultimately take place, if it does take place, I can't say. But that's how I view it. And in a sense, my interest is in not merely promoting the ideas, the extraordinary ideas that mainstream culture backs away from, but I want to say these phenomena have something to do with our future. So let's pay attention, because the creative implications of a fully evolved, psychically evolved human being would be a great benefit for the human race. because
Yeah.
it involves an expansion of consciousness, greater degrees of empathy, which would have implications for how we relate to each other.
Yeah.
So that's my background and sort of where I'm at today. And I should say this, that my sense of the future, what we need, I don't think abstract philosophy is going to do it, but I'm interested in the arts as ways of becoming more conscious and more human. Not that I'm opposed to science, obviously not, but I'll just add that concluding point about my where I've always been and where I continue to go, to somehow combine all that I've learned with the arts, you see. So I'm into music, I'm into painting, and so forth.
Yeah. So it's kind of that the merging of creativity and science and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I would say something like that. And
Yeah. Fascinating though. There's so many different areas, different directions I could go to unpack in the things you've just told me. I think the first one is you said that you had an ESP experience and you spoke to your colleague, your friend about that at university, your classmate or whatever. Can you talk about that experience? When was your first kind of interaction with anything?
I can. It's a minor thing, but I still remember it.
Yeah.
Decades.
Yeah.
I had moved around the block to a new home in Astoria. We were living in Astoria, and I hardly knew many of the kids. I was about maybe 8 years old at that time. And I had one morning, Saturday morning, an enormously vivid dream that a kid named Johnny, whom I knew he existed, but I never played with him. I dreamt of this kid, and he's bouncing a ball, and he says, "Want to play off the wall?" That's what we used to do. We used to hit the side of the wall and go out in the street and catch. So that was a dream, and it was vivid. And I woke up, and I forgot about the dream. You know, it was a vivid dream, but I wasn't monitoring my dreams.
Yeah.
Had breakfast, went out, stepped out of the house. First thing I see is Johnny. He's got a ball in his hand, and he says, "You want to play ball?"
Really?
It's a minor little thing, right? But it definitely precognized, anticipated, enabled me to see what was coming. And even at that age, it struck me as strange, although I had no words to describe it. So I still remember it. So that was just the first experience. And then throughout my life, I have periodic encounters. One of the more recent I'll mention, it's very practical, almost Socratic in its practicality.
Yeah.
I woke up one morning and I started to make the bed, as I normally do. And suddenly it was almost as though something grabbed my hands, and I grabbed the sheets, and I felt I had to go downstairs and put the sheets in the laundry and clean them. I never, ever did anything like that. I always think of cleaning later in the day. So I go downstairs and I notice that something happened with the water. I had a giant sink and the water was right to the very edge, about to overflow onto the basement. Normally I don't go down there. If I had not gone down there, my basement would have been completely flooded. Again, this is a helpful illustration. And so I immediately plunged my hand in, I did something, and I loosened it, the water drained out, and walked back upstairs and had breakfast. So, I mean, that was a kind of, slightly different. It wasn't I didn't dream it, but I felt possessed.
Yeah.
Not in an
Compelled.
unpleasant way, but I just had to go down and do that. And I found something that was dangerous to me and resolved it. And again, these are minor. I have lots, really. I had perhaps one of the most memorable in 1981, when President Reagan was nearly assassinated. I was teaching philosophy. Before he was assassinated, I had 3 dreams of the attempts to assassinate him, each dream giving me some details. And I remember on the 3rd dream, I reported to my students. I said, I had these dreams, and I didn't expect anything to happen. A couple of days later, one of my students pulls me up. It's Dr. Grosso. She was breathless. You're a psychic. The president has almost been assassinated. So again, 3 dreams about 2 weeks in advance, very specific images. In the last image, I see Reagan naked from the waist up, looking very good. So I thought to myself, well, that means he's going to recover quickly. And he did. Yeah. For a guy his age, and the fact that he was shot. So stuff like that, and I can go on with stories. And I've also witnessed and met people with strange abilities. I had a student of mine who said she had out-of-body experiences. And I said, great, why don't you come and visit me someday, as a joke. Mm-hmm. A couple of nights later, I get up in the morning, I should say a couple of mornings later, I get up and I notice my music stand, which I held in a certain part of the living room, always, never moved it, was right in the middle. And I'm thinking, what the heck's going on? Well, I'm leaving by myself at that time. And while I'm thinking this, phone rings, and my student says, how do you like the new furniture rearrangement? Right. And then she told me that the previous night, I was in the kitchen, she got out of her body, and she said, I'm going to go visit Dr. Grosso. And lo and behold, she finds herself in my house. She's floating along, and she sees me where I was in the kitchen, working with my head, in a cup of coffee or something. She tried to get my attention, and it angered her that she couldn't do it. And then she floats around, and she notices the music stand. She said, I'm going to try and move this. And she succeeded. And I had the proof. There's nobody in that house. There's no way that I can explain this other than a human being got out of her body about 20, 30 miles away from where I was living, came and visited me and manipulated my furniture, which I observed correctly, which is exactly what she told me that she did. There's no way I can escape the reality of that. I mean, lots of these experiences are, iffy, not that. So anyway, I'll stop. These are some of the examples that have
one is wild
into this area.
Yeah. Again, there's so many different roads I could take here. Everything you say is really grabbing me right now. But I mean, just in a kind of 1 or 2 word answer, like how frequently do you have experiences yourself that you notice, that you remark and say, okay, that I think was Psi or ESP?
I would. It's not that regular. It's once in a while.
Yeah.
But I'm expecting something to happen soon because I haven't had any striking events. Yeah. And also it depends on who I'm hanging out with and what I'm doing. But it's not a constant thing and not something I can rely upon. It just hits me from time to time.
Yeah.
And I get the feeling why. I get the feeling I'm being instructed from my own subconscious or maybe something outside of myself. Who knows?
Yeah. But, do you think it depends on... Sorry, I was just going to say, do you think it depends at all upon your state of mind, or we have for 6 months we might be in a more positive state of mind, and then for a few months we might something might go wrong and we're feeling a bit negative. Have you ever noticed any kind of correlation with that kind of thing?
Actually, no, it's totally unexpected. And I mean, the night I went to sleep, where I was awakened about the flood in my basement, it was a perfectly normal night. There was nothing special about it. Of course, I was in an altered state. I was dreaming. Wait, no, that was not the dream. That was not what I just told you. No, there was nothing there. The event was triggered by my trying to make the bed. And so there are different ways that these events take. And sometimes, they're through the agency of another person, as with my student.
Yeah.
And she proved to me that she could do it. And incidentally, there's more to tell about her, about ghosts. Because you said something about wanting to talk about. When we get to that, I'll tell you a story.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll circle back to that. I'll write down your student's ghost story. What I was going to say is, did you talk to her? I suppose you did, in a bit of detail afterwards, after that experience. And, did you ask her, like, what did it feel like? What was that experience like for you? Did she give you much information in terms of that? Like, her subjective experience?
You're talking about when she moved my furniture, my music stand. Yeah, that was Elizabeth Sebin. I still remember her name. I don't really recall. She was very bright. she was into anthropology,
Mm-hmm.
and she was clever, and she was married, and she had a great sense of humor. But no, I don't recall us discussing. It just happened, and it was,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah, and that stuck with you for a long time. What about macro PK? What was your first introduction to, something physical, being something, witnessing
Right.
something?
Well, let me see. Off the top of my head, I'm trying to think. I can't right now. I'm not getting any. I'm sure I've had some physical events that I can talk to you about, but right now my mind's blank on that.
Yeah.
If it comes back, comes to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fine. Well, I guess I'll kind of rephrase it and I say, when did that first kind of enter your awareness, and when did you first sort of take that seriously? The idea of us being able to manipulate our environment in various ways.
Well, I mean, the example I just gave is an illustration of the physical effect, right?
Sure, that's true. Actually, yeah, moving the thing. Yeah, that's a good point.
And I witnessed there was in New York City, I don't know, a decade or so ago, reports of a church which had a St. Irene's in Astoria, Queens, and I happened to live in Astoria when I was a kid. And I heard the news where I was living in the village at that time in New York, and about this saint whose body or a cross or something that belonged to her was shedding tears. A photograph, actually, or a small statue. Now that I remember that, and so I had known about this phenomenon of paintings of Christ bleeding, portraits of the Virgin Mary somehow coming to life and stuff. So I and a buddy of mine, as a writer, went to Astoria. We drove, and we both got online and got a chance to observe this statue with these tears. I could see it was coming right around the eyes, and then it would drop. I didn't see it drop, but I did see the tears formed on the eye. And I had a chat with some of the priests there, and they confirmed, people came from all over the place to witness this thing. So that was a physical, inexplicable physical event that I witnessed. And I'm trying to think, okay, here's something physical. One of my students one day told me about a game that she played when she was a kid, that the other kids would they would touch her and say rise, and she would levitate. So I thought I was teaching a course on parapsychology. That's why it came up. So I said to me, well, let's try it right now. So I picked the heaviest guy, an ex-Marine, massive dude, right about 200 pounds, smart guy, by the way. And I said, sit down in a chair, and I picked 4 of the frailest young women in the class, and I had them put their fingers like this, and not in a position to drag or pull, but just to touch underneath the knees and underneath the elbows. And I said, and by the way, I expected nothing to happen, but I said, why not? We're into this.
Yeah.
So I chanted something, and to make a long story short, and I said, lift. And up in the air, he went. I will never forget the astonished look on this guy's face. He's like this. The young women were not tall, but as far as they could reach up, they had him up in the air. And then you would think if they let go, it would have been serious, because it was at least 5 feet in the air. And then very gently, they lowered their hands and he came down. Physical effect. That blew my mind. Meanwhile, of course, I've been reading about levitation and knowing that these things are, but I didn't expect it to happen in the context of a class. And so that's another bit of my experience that contributed to my impulse to pursue this.
Yeah.
But now my main idea, again, just to wrap it up about my work and research, I'm trying to think of how all of this promises, points toward the evolution of human beings. I mean, why else do we have these things, these powers? They're latent, and they emerge under special circumstances. What science needs to do is to learn how to get in there and control the process and gradually learn to evolve systematically. But we're a long way from even beginning that as an idea. But I do see a new form of humanity. I hope and see in my imagination a new form of humanity emerging from these definitely real potentials that people seem to possess. Yeah,
absolutely. Imagine the kind of research that could be done if it was widely accepted and everything.
Exactly,
like that.
Exactly. And it's a challenge.
Yeah, indeed. Have you ever bent a spoon, Michael?
Have I been what?
Bent a spoon yourself?
Bent a spoon. Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, yes, I do. In fact, and I used it. I have half of it that I glued onto a wooden plate, and I made a portrait of an impish-looking guy, and I glued the paranormally created spoon into the place of his ear. And I have it hanging somewhere. I can take a break later. I'll look for it and I'll show it to you.
Yeah, cool.
It's the only time it happened to me once. I've had a lot of one-time encounters. And yes, I did do that, and I made an art object out of it.
Were you alone when you did it, or were you with a group? Not the painting, the bending.
The bending. Let me see. I think I was alone. Yeah, I was alone.
Okay, interesting. Right. Yeah, cool.
And
sorry, were you going to continue?
I was definitely alone. When I'm alone, I try things.
Yeah. I've tried the spoon so many times. I haven't had any luck with it yet. But
me neither. After it's never happened.
Yeah. So I'll be happy if I can get my once like you. I'll take it.
Right.
So you mentioned levitation a minute ago when we were talking about your students in the classroom. That brings us perfectly on to talk about the Joseph of Copertino, who you wrote a book about. You wrote the Man Who Could Fly. So I'd love it if you could spend a few minutes talk in a bit of detail, if that's okay, and tell us about Joseph, who he was, about your book and about Joseph himself, and why he's so interesting to us right now in this conversation. Okay. And again, just bear in mind that probably most, or at least a good number of the people watching this and listening to this probably have no idea who he was.
Right.
Well, Joseph, kind of the beginners.
Joseph of Copertino was born in 1603 in Copertino, southern Italy, and he died 60 years later. He was, the first 5 years of his life, horribly ill. So ill that he was, in a sense, seemed mentally retarded. His family were impoverished, and he was living with his mother and I think a sister at least, in a very poor circumstances. So he's been known to be a saint that began under the worst possible beginnings, because he started out sick, and he would often open his mouth as though he was looking like a complete idiot, but actually he wasn't, because he got very early on into the mood of praying. So he would pray, and they would call him Boca Aperta, open mouth. That was his nickname.
Wow.
And they thought that was a sign of his idiocy, as it were. But actually, that's not true. He was getting lost in his meditations. So when he finally heals, and there are many details here I'm leaving out, and he got better. The first thing he realized he was hopeless. He couldn't do anything. He just had no ability to do anything. So he tried to get into several different church organizations, monasteries and whatnot. And each time, one time he got invited in for several months, and all he could do was take care of a mule. And when he brought food, it was clumsy. He would drop things and break things. So they fired him, as it were. And that was the end. Finally, he kept persisting, and he finally got himself a position in a Franciscan group. Francis was, of course, one of his models and heroes. And that was the beginning of his career as a miracle man, because during that period, as far as I know, the first time he levitated, he was standing in front of a portrait of the Madonna. And she was his greatest invitation. His own mother was very unpleasant and mean-spirited. And so one day he was in front of that painting, and up he went. And before long, when he finally got to the point where he was a full-fledged priest, he was unable to perform as a priest, because when he would say Mass, he would get so ecstatically engrossed in what he was doing that he would quietly start to rise off the ground. And there's a bunch of people in the church, you can imagine it, right? And they're listening, probably semi-bored, the usual stuff. And there's the priest up in the air. So they went crazy. Before you know it, he became increasingly famous for not only for his levitations, but he had an incredible ability to read your mind to such a degree. What he would do, he would hang out with his fellow priests and monks and whatnot, and he'd say, "You're not thinking of what you're supposed to be thinking right now. You're thinking of having dinner when you're supposed to be saying prayers." And he got so annoying that he caught people straying inwardly, that the superior said, "Giuseppe, how about being a little more discreet with your," he didn't use the term ESP, but that's what he meant, you see. Yeah. Leave us alone. Stop bothering us all the time for trivial things. Yeah. So basically, whenever he appeared on a scene for a holiday, a Mass, things would go crazy because something would happen. He would heal somebody on the spot. He would just go up in the air. He would sometimes take people up with him. A wonderful story really? Of a local person who was crazy, that was supposed to be whatever his problem was, I don't know. But yeah. And Joseph grabs him, hugs him, and the two of them, in front of other people, go up into the air. And by the way, the report said he would stay levitated for hours sometimes. I don't know about the data supporting that, but a long time, not just a second, 15 minutes, half an hour, almost an hour. And by the time this guy came down, they hugged each other, and he walked away completely okay mentally. So stories like that, and Joseph is probably, scholars that I've quoted in my book make it clear that he's peerless for the sheer variety and numerical greatness of the phenomena. We have at least 150 sworn depositions about his levitations from all kinds of people, surgeons, artists, a pope. Pope's not going to make up stories. Nuns, cardinals, ambassadors from Spain.
150.
But the fact of the matter is that 150 is just a fragment of people who, for 35 years, nonstop, wherever he went, things happened. Thousands of people must have witnessed him. Yeah. And got to the point where wherever he was, created such a ruckus. The church figured to save him from being oppressed by people wanted to grab him and use him one way or another, right? And the women were all over him and drove him nuts. They basically sent him step by step to more remote monasteries where there were fewer and fewer people, and eventually it said, you can hang out by yourself and don't have to do anything public. But by that time, everybody knew about him. So he lived the latter part of his life trying to be just by himself, because the moment people interacted with him, he would do things and upset the entire order, as it were, of the day. So these are some of the things that I read about that led me to investigate, to write the book. And my approach was, I'm interested in the really shocking, bizarre phenomena, as long as there's good evidence for them. Because if I'm going to make it a point, if I want to kick the scientific reductionistic worldview in the behind, I'm going to do it with the most powerful examples at my disposal. So I have my own experience, phenomena I've noticed, and of course I've read not only about Joseph, but all kinds of phenomena. For years I've been doing it, and I'm still doing it. Right now, nowadays, I'm finding marvelous reports of near-death experiences online, and also UFO experiences. That's another area, which only recently has become opening up to the public. But we have yet to get the mainstream culture to admit the reality of the paranormal. Many of them do secretly, but they're afraid they're going to lose their jobs. I mean, the book on St. Joseph was originally published by Oxford University Press. They gave me a contract. I wrote the book. Everybody loved the book. And then one day, before the book came out, I got a letter from an unnamed philosopher. And he said, you can't publish this book unless you have to not explicitly conclude that Joseph ever levitated. So I quit on the spot. That's the reason I wrote the book. And I was not going to be bullied into concealing the most important finding because they're worried about the appearance of publishing something that's just a little too weird for Oxford University Press. Now, Oxford University Press soon after published several books on levitation, one about women who levitate. But guess what? There's no discussion of the real thing. It's just, they kind of had dreamy ideas about floating away in the world. But so so I had a touch of that experience. And there's a whole history of scholarship being crapped on by mainstream culture and so-called intellectuals because they've touched on this forbidden area.
Yeah.
But, I by the way, I found a new publisher in one day. One day. Wow. Not the greatest, but they did a good job producing the book. They didn't promote it.
And so you were able to put your real conclusion at the end.
Oh, yeah.
Which was that you fully believe, you are convinced via the data that he was genuine.
For sure. And of course, I don't just talk about Joseph's paranormal. I make parallels. There are, if I recall correctly, at least 150 saints who have been documented cases of levitation. The Catholic Church is not into promoting phony stuff. Quite the opposite. They're harsh and highly critical because they have their reputation at stake. They also have a couple of thousand years of experience, and they know there's a lot of phony stuff mixed up. But on the other hand, it provides a background for a lot of really striking phenomena. St. Teresa of Avila, for example, was a great levitator and a great intellect. And but she prayed for the levitations to cease. And they did. Joseph did the same thing, but they didn't. On his deathbed, he levitated. That's another interesting story. on his deathbed. He was up in the air and absolutely ecstatic that he was about to die. He had no doubts where he was going.
Because that was the thing about Joseph, wasn't it? He was always ecstatic when he would have these things. So I don't know about always, but that was like normally the thing that would, the catalyst.
Excuse me.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I was just mentioning how it's like Joseph always seems to be in ecstasy when he levitates. He seems to be having such a great time and this blissful experience.
Absolutely critical variable. And not only for Joseph.
The other saints as well.
An ecstatic state seems to be the key altered state of consciousness that is conducive to paranormal phenomena in general, and in particular, levitation. All the great saints, you read about them, or mediums, or shamans, where there are reports of levitation, they're always in ecstasy. I had one woman that I put her story in my book that was in Spain fairly recently, before I wrote the book, and she witnessed a nun in an obscure, isolated, and empty church in prayer, levitate right in front of her. And she was with another person, and they wrote down their observations, shared it with me, and I stuck them in my book to show that it's still happening. See?
Yeah.
But there's no one like Joseph around, not that I know of.
What do you make of the, because back then when Joseph was active and with all these priests levitating and everything like that, I suppose back then the explanatory framework would have been God. It's God, it's Jesus doing this.
Or the devil.
Or the devil, right.
In other
exactly.
words, the church had this idea that the diabolic dimension was also a source of phenomena. So that had to be cleared. And Joseph was dragged in front of the Inquisition at least 2 or 3 times because they were suspicious of him. Mm-hmm. But every time he passed with, he was so pious and naively direct that they finally realized that this guy is the real McCoy, and that's when they tried to help him by hiding him. Because wherever he was a riot of attention, which would be distracting to whatever they were doing at the time.
Yeah. And what do you make of it in terms of any explanatory framework? I know obviously we can't give a full, comprehensive, definite answer to that, but what are your thoughts? Why do you think as well that do you think it does seem to be more prevalent in religious, circles or people that follow a specific religion? Is it more common in those people? And what do you make, how do you try and explain it?
Well, it's quite a mystery, but it does occur out of other contexts. When I first published the book, I got stories from people that were interesting. I'll give one example. A guy was on a boat with his buddies, and he fell off the boat. And as he was falling, the other people on the boat were watching him, and he described to me, he suddenly slowed up long enough for them to reach out and grab him and save him. And it blew everybody's mind. So there was a kind of temporary levitation that saved him from being maybe caught right underneath that boat and destroyed. So these stories, and why would that happen? Being on the threshold of death is a kind of ecstasy. Ekstasis means out, stasis standing, out, standing outside of yourself. Now, why? You asked about theory. One simple thing I can say is this. If you're in a state of ecstasy, you're not in your normal state of mind. So all the normal stuff, the ego sense, self-preoccupations, fears, emotions that clutter the normal stream of your awareness are wiped out. See, that happens in a near-death experience. The consciousness it doesn't cease. It gets torn away from the body. You're dying, right? And that's when people have these amazing experiences, near-death experiences, which I'm sure you know all about. So I think that ecstasy is the key altered state that enables us to make contact with what I call the creative unconscious. In my judgment, everybody is in tune at a very deep level with what I call mind at large. It's not my phrase. It goes back to Aldous Huxley. The great mind, what the Upanishads knew thousands of years ago. What is yoga all about? It's about emptying your mind. The void is one of the great symbols for enlightenment. What does that mean? What it means is void, empty your mind of all the distractions, the fears, the anger, the whole works, you see. And somehow that increases the possibility of making a contact or the rise into your full awareness of these deeper layers of consciousness. So that's one approach. And actually, I have written up another physical theory of how levitation is possible. And I ran it past some friends of mine who are physicists, and one of them who specializes in hyperspace. And I'll give you my take. And when I wrote it up and sent it to him, Carr is his last name, English physicist.
Bernard Carr.
Bernard Carr, exactly. And he accepted it as plausible, which I was pleased. And it's simple. I can explain it. Have you ever dreamt that you were flying yourself?
Once, I think. Only once.
Me too. Once, right. So you can do things in dream space that you can't do in physical space. Now, Bernard Carr, in one of his writings, describes how different kinds of space can be, under special circumstances, compacted into one space, so that in that one space, both properties or features of each separate space are active. So my theory is this: if you're ecstatic and you're out of your normal self, it may be that you are able then to merge, even though you're physically awake, but to merge with your dream space. And while in the dream space, you would then be able to levitate. So my feeling is that Joseph, or the saints or the shamans, when they're so deeply absorbed in something outside of themselves, they make room for their psychic apparatus to be, so to speak, enmeshed with dream space. The dreams is like intermediary between waking world and total unconscious world. And in that state, one temporarily becomes immune to the force of gravity, as it happens in dream space, where there's no evidence of any gravity operating on the body. So you're able to have these experiences. But anyway, I haven't thought of ways to test this, and I'm not much of a scientist, but that's my take. That it has some merit, because a number of my colleagues have said, yeah, maybe, but they left it at that.
Yeah, maybe in the future we'll have more science in this area, and there'll be more researchers actually looking into it.
If science could get serious in this stuff, it would be a different thing.
Absolutely. Different world we'd be living in right now. I wanted to ask you just quickly before we move on to a different topic. I'm conscious of the time, and there's a few things I really want to get stuck into with you as well. Right. But just one last quick question in this area is, you must have come across this incorruptible body phenomenon.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if that's the right wording. I don't know if that happened to Joseph. I'm assuming it did happen to at least some of the saints that you looked at. But what do you make of that? There's where like they die.
Another real puzzler. It has nothing to do with the greatness of the saint, by the way. Lots of minor saints have that effect. Others, very famous, you might expect. But I have no idea how that works, you see. And other
You ever heard of a
than
case that wasn't, sorry to interrupt you, Michael. I was just going to say, have you ever heard of a case that wasn't like a Catholic or religious person?
well, yes, there's a Buddhist case, a Tibetan Buddhist case, written by actually and studied by a Catholic priest.
Okay.
One of those cool open guys, you know.
Yeah.
And he
Nice.
and he writes at length about the one famous case. I've forgotten the name of the mystic, Tibetan mystic. But what happens, since the Tibetan mystic thinks that the void is the ultimate symbol and doesn't worry about the spiritual body as the Catholics do. This particular individual, after he died, within about 9 days, each day his body got smaller, and there were observers, including this priest, who knew this was happening. The body got smaller and smaller until it shrank into nothing and it disappeared. So that's not quite the same as, but it's something that happens to a corpse, just a kind of retro PK, right? And that we could say is operating on the Catholic mystic or the Tibetan mystic. And what the expectation is, if the expectation is the spiritual body, as in the Christian tradition, you get cases of incorruptibility. And by the way, some of those cases are really, really weird, almost comically weird. Like the story of one story that the corpse would sit up and start pointing to people. I mean, really weird stuff that taxes even my wide open sensibility. But it's full of strange stuff. What can I say?
Yeah.
But that would the best I can say in terms of your question.
No, thank you. I mean, it's fascinating. Like, I feel like you have the same kind of frustration as me. Is like we want to understand more about that. We want to know more about that, but it's such a mysterious, elusive, and confusing.
And what about the ability to go, not for a couple of days, but for months and years without eating anything? There are well-documented cases in the Christian and in the Eastern traditions that I've looked at, and these are not people who are, struggling, turning into skeletons. Teresa Neumann in the 20th century was a German mystic. According to everything I've read, the last 35 years of her life, she ate nothing and eliminated nothing. And she was very public. And she was, I would not say fat, but kind of, nice little plumpish sort of person. Never seen, and she would do things in public with people and go to meetings and everything. This is during the reign of the Nazis, by the way. And the Nazis, they stopped giving her food stamps because she was so well known that she doesn't eat. That's interesting. Wow. Right?
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
And
that's crazy.
So, and she was, as I say, it started day by day, and then eventually, for 35 years, the last 35 years of her life, she ate nothing. And and she was perfectly healthy, and she never went into a bathroom. I mean, people were watching. Oh, and they also did a two weeks test where they watched her for 14 days, day and night. They had people observing her to make sure she didn't go to the potty, and then she didn't sneak, a hot dog somewhere. Nothing, but 2 solid weeks. Anyway, so that's another area of superhuman functioning that we have real evidence for. How does it work? I don't know. She said she was fed, nourished by the host. Oh, I forgot. She did eat something. She would eat a quarter of a Eucharistic host wafer. You know what that is, right? It's just a little white wafer, thin. There's no
just like for like communion or something. That kind of thing they would eat back then. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a big thing. And there are just dozens of weird Eucharistic miracles. There's some taking place right now that I've been following in the United States. So these things are happening, but they don't happen, all the time. But neither do geniuses appear every time. I mean, there are some people that are just, it happens.
Yeah, we have the word generational for, certain things like in sports and stuff like that. Sometimes you can go a generation without somebody, coming out that has a certain level of skill or mentality for a sport. And I suppose it's exactly the same thing here.
Right.
To continue on your journey into these phenomena that are particularly elusive, evasive, confusing, like riddles almost, but so compelling and fascinating. You wrote a paper, I don't know how long ago, called Dark Psyche, that hopefully one day you may turn into a book. Could you talk about that paper, about the research that went into it, and about the darker side of psychical research?
I didn't look at it until just recently, and I don't remember everything. But what prompted me to write this paper. I had a student of mine again who told me about her husband, who when he was about 14, 15 years old, he went to Coney Island, and he was with young kids, and he went into a fortune teller, or she kind of beckoned him, and he went in and he paid her maybe some peanuts, whatever it was, and she looks at his palm and she says, "Oh, I can see you're going to have a beautiful life. You're going to have a beautiful wife," and then she said a couple of very nice things, paused, and then said, "And you're going to die when you're 35 years old." And okay, you're guessing now what happened. The nurse told me this, and that her husband on his 35th birthday just keeled over and died for no reason at all. When the doctors did an autopsy and all that, nothing. Absolutely nothing. So the idea planted in his mind by a totally irresponsible, imbecile psychic killed him. It somehow, that's all you can say, right? Those are the facts. So I begin my story and about that, and I go into sorcery, where bad intentioned people can just mentally do things. I'll tell you a very quick story. Want to hear a quick story to illustrate it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
This is a guy I met in Oaxaca, Mexico, about 25 years ago. And this guy was, I was with a buddy of mine or a girlfriend, honestly forget, but what I remember this experience. So I see this guy, he's an American, he's a tall, slender guy, pale. He comes up to me and shakes my hand, and his hand is ice cold in a hot summer day in Mexico. And he starts to tell me his story. He was out looking for ayahuasca, and he passed by a house, a little house, and there was a woman inside an outside shower, bathing naked. So, as any guy might want, he liked the sight of it, and he let her know that he was watching. But he didn't know that she was a known sorceress. And he found out when he went home that night. This is the story he told me. Sure, he could have made it up, but I don't think so. That's why I'm telling you I believed him. When he went home and went to sleep, he started to have the most horrible nightmares of bugs and worms crawling all over him, bats attacking him, couldn't sleep. And this went on for a while until he met some American preacher in the town where he was, and said that, knew that about this particular woman. And the Christian preacher did his own magic, spiritual practice with this gentleman. and got him to the point where he was fairly functional. And so that's just a kind of example of a sorcerer. Again, a very compelling story in my judgment.
Just to jump in on it really quickly,
yeah.
She didn't like tell him she was, I'm going to use the word cursing.
No, she just made contact with him mentally.
Yeah.
And
so we can't put it down to his own belief, bringing as per your introduction.
Right. Oh no, I don't think anyone could. You'd have to be suicidal to dream stuff like that against yourself. No, but I mean that's just one case. But anyway, so there are many ways in which I try to describe the dark side of the paranormal, and one historical period was the great witch craze of the 16th and 17th century in Europe, where, in fact, the century that Joseph lived, the 17th century, was at the peak of witchcraft. And in this case, there was a period of Western history which was really nightmarishly horrible. Anyone could accuse anybody of being in league with the devil, and the moment you were accused, you were critiqued or even arrested and tortured. It was routine to torture. And of course, the theologians of that day dreamed up this ideas, they had they were experts on the devil, right? And at any rate, well, I forget exactly how long that period, but at least 100 years, the high point of the witch craze, where hundreds of thousands of innocent people were put to death. Maybe not hundreds, but certainly many thousands. And mostly women. All you had to do was accuse somebody. There was no trial. The accusation was sufficient. And when they accused you, if you didn't admit that you were doing this or that, they took it upon themselves to torture you until you did admit. Yeah. So that's an ugly period of history, but also an illustration of how the dark side of the psyche can take possession of not just a few people, but a whole epoch of history. And lots of marvelous books written on the subject. And in my essay there, I quote a lengthy part of one of the classic studies of demonology, which these men, they're all men, make general assessments of women as the female gender. And it would be hilarious if it wasn't horrifying. The official theological in quotes, claims about women being naturally evil, naturally more lusty than men. Bullshit. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. But it was a bunch of lies. And for well over 100 years, it was awful. I mean, so anyway, I go into that in some detail, and I would develop that section because there are aspects of it today, not quite the same. But fundamentalism today is still an operative force of unpleasant consequences in many ways. Yeah, but we won't. Yeah. I don't want to go into that. So, ouch. Anyway, I also have a discussion in this chapter, which I'm going to expand, obviously, of how a part of sorcery is name calling, because the power of the name. If you start calling somebody a witch, and you're in an atmosphere or an environment where people believe in witchcraft and are disposed for fearful reasons to believe in it, you're already creating havoc for that person. And we see the same thing today in politics. And I won't mention the name of a particular politician who is talented at destroying people with nasty names he dreams up for them, which is not my idea of reason or rational politics, and I'm sure it's not yours. So I get into that. You see, what I try to do in this chapter is I go the classic forms of the dark side and the historical manifestations, but I want to make it very clear it's happening today in different ways, subtle ways.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that's pretty much the main thrust of that. But I am going to work on this, and I'm pretty sure I can get it published easily, because it's not just about the paranormal; it's the dark side. So publishers,
exactly.
they'll like that, you see.
Yeah, for sure. I don't think you'll have any problem, and you think people will be queuing up to read it. I, for one, will want to read it. It's too curious.
Well,
do you cover?
I'm sorry.
Sorry, go on.
No. You've got a copy. I mean, and any comments that remember, it's incomplete. It's just raw beginnings. Any thoughts you have when you do read it, let me know. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I will. Yeah. What was I going to say? I almost lost it there. Okay, possessions. Did you cover possessions in it as well? Did you? Because this is something I started to think about, and there are some types of possessions that seem very different to others. Let's say, I think I briefly spoke to Ed Kelly about this, and that's where he kind of got inspired to connect us. But he mentioned, I think it was you, he said, that had looked into this phenomenon in great detail, and I think maybe out of thousands of cases, or at least hundreds, you did come across maybe 2 or something that were seemingly like this diabolical possession, where like the things out of horror movies where kids are speaking in Latin and walking up walls or what have you. I don't know the details, but the really scary stuff. Are you familiar with that?
I am, but I'm not enough to speak even with any names or references. But there's no question about the fact that about this business of enhanced telepathic contact and speaking in languages that you've never learned. But in a sense, we're all partially possessed by anything that fascinates us. In witchcraft, the word fascinate was a key word. When we say, "Oh, he's a fascinating talker" or something, that's one thing. But fascination in witchcraft means an hypnotic possession of a person. And so it entails a form of possession where you lose your autonomy and are sucked into a whirlpool, as it were, of mental activity that's not your own, or is totally irregular for your personality. But there's lots of material out there, but I don't really have any specific examples off the top of my head that I can share with you right now. But what I have read convinces me of the reality. I mean, it's a type of ecstasy, right? Possession. So if ecstasy is emptying yourself and then letting the beautiful and the divine enter you, it could also be a means through which the darker aspects of the subconscious mind could take possession of you. So it seems to me that if ecstasy is possible, so is possession.
Do you think there is like things such as good and evil, or do you think that's too simplistic a way of looking at what is ultimately kind of naturalistic? Most likely naturalistic
do not
processes?
believe in entities in the universe or in life that are essentially dedicated to harm or produce evil effects on people. But we can, there are reasonable definitions of good and bad, of good and evil. I prefer the word bad than evil, because it does have that connotation of something divinely sinister. And there are things that lead you to believe that there might be something like that, but I myself don't believe it. I don't believe in the devil, but I do believe that there are people of diabolic disposition, so to speak. I think lying is a form of diabolic possession. I mean, there are people that can't tell the truth. There's just, and it's what could be more destructive if you have a malignant liar in your midst, right, in your party, in your world. At what point does it become abnormal, paranormal, it's difficult to say. Difficult, and one wants to be careful about the language. But that's it, yeah.
In a nutshell, what would you have you thought about, have you speculated in your own mind what might be behind, like I say, these cases of children that have like a diabolical possession where they're doing things that are really, disturbing their family or whatever. They're speaking in Latin, they're saying things that they've never said, and they're acting like totally different and out of character. Have you have you allowed yourself to speculate on that and think what could cause that? Because obviously it's easy to think, oh yeah, evil or bad, or it's some kind of force coming through that's the opposite of good, that's bad, evil. But short of that simplistic way of looking at it, what else do you think could be behind that? What could explain that?
It's possible that some highly receptive people, under the influence of hypnotists, for example, or some kind of a psychic, might be able to control them by suggestion. The history of hypnosis and mesmerism early in the 18th century, more interesting than it is today, full of examples of this sort of thing. And so the source of the evil would be the suggestions in a person's education. Look, there are things that one finds in one's own experience, perverse actions that we may have. I don't know, or a streak of, let's say, sometimes I'm annoyed by somebody. I might have a momentary impulse to say something very cruel that I know is not justified, and then I do it. You see, it's a kind of possession. So there are degrees here of influence, just as there are degrees, incredible varieties and different degrees of paranormal phenomena. Like PK can be shockingly powerful in its effects, but it can be very subtle, just causing one to have an anxious mood, a rise in maybe a feeling of bad, of a stomach ache or something, rather than a complete shattering effect. Yeah. But as long as we accept the reality of psi, right, the telepathic, the clairvoyant, the mental and the physical dimension of the paranormal, all kinds of things become possible, and depends on the culture, the context, the moods, and the personalities involved. So increasingly, my sense is that anything is possible. But again, I want evidence. I want to be sure, but I'm open. But I have to take it case by case. But in general, I say one thing, but specifically, I zero in on the real case. That seems the right way to do it.
Yeah. Just in a nutshell, well, let's move on a little bit from what we were talking about. Let's move on from the dark side for now. Maybe we'll get back to it in a future conversation, I hope. Right. But for now, let's just talk briefly, maybe five minutes or so, about what happens after we die. So I'm sure you're with me in that the body of evidence suggests we survive in some capacity. I guess the nutshell answer I'm looking for you is, what are your thoughts and speculations and feelings on in what capacity we survive and how that would look?
Well, there are two things. There are some philosophical arguments that I think are important. And for example, I'll just say this briefly. There are philosophical and empirical data that clearly suggest, sometimes very strongly, that we do survive. What happens when we do survive, that's another question, but that we do survive. And the philosophical argument is simply the fact that our minds and our bodies are two different things. And we are constantly, we cannot escape our minds. At this moment, I'm in a body here. I had an operation on my hand recently, but it's healing. Physical, it's out there. My thoughts that are directing what I'm saying, you can't see, I can't see. They're invisible, intangible. And I can never get out of my mind as long as I'm alive. I'm always in my mind somehow. So it is something separate but intimately related to my body. So the question then is, if two things are intimately related, and something can happen, well, death, that would simply separate them. Okay, so that it doesn't, I'm not shocked by the idea that the mind would survive the death of the body, but I don't believe it unless I have evidence. So the next step is the empirical. Now, nowadays, we're getting a lot of information about the near-death experience. A lot of people don't know that's only one form of evidence that points suggestively toward life after death. There's reincarnation stuff, but there's also apparitions of the dead. Okay, here's one very brief experience that I had. It was a very hot night. I was living in New Jersey at that time. And I got out of my bed and went into the living room where it was cooler. And I lay down and I'm awake. And I suddenly look up and there's my dead grandmother right in front of me. And with her is a woman. I don't know who the heck she is. And I'm staring and they're sort of looking at me and through me the same time. And then they vanished. But I got a very vivid picture. So I called up my mom, told her I'm coming to visit you. I got a question. She lived in Astoria. I was in Manhattan. And and I told her what happened. She took out a photograph of, on her mother's side, that's the grandmother that I saw, family. I had never seen this photograph. I immediately picked out the woman who actually looked a little bit like my mother. She was a very beautiful woman, by the way. This who was next to so was my grandmother. They were cutie pies, both of them. And so I recognized immediately. So I don't consider that proof of survival, but it's certainly highly suggestive. How was I able to dream, well, not in dream, have an apparition of a person I recognize that I've never seen before? My mother told me something that may have explained the visitation from what would have been my great aunt or something, my grandmother's sister. This woman, when I was born, came to visit my mother to see me. My mother had me in a little crib. She was embarrassed about the crib. It was a broken down crib. And she said, he's sleeping. Don't leave him alone. And so she and her sister, who was my grandmother, chatted and then left. So my speculation is that maybe in the afterlife, my grandmother's sister and grandmother got together one day. Let's go visit Mike, see if we can catch him. And they said, that's the only connection that I can make. But they were all to answer your question, there were all kinds of evidence pointing towards survival. And some of them are so compelling that it's very hard to stop saying this is suggestive. But,
I agree.
It has to be. It's an inference that we're making here. And all kinds of stuff. And it's been throughout history, there's evidence for these things. And so,
if we broke up the big body of evidence, because we're both on the same page, the body of evidence, the reason it's so compelling is because there's so much of it. But if we broke all of that up into separate elements like NDEs, like you say, reincarnation, apparitions, mediumship, whatever, all these different areas, which area would you say is the most compelling as a standalone?
I think that you have to see them all together. In other words, the combination.
Just going to avoid my question.
No, I don't have an answer for it. I wouldn't. Right now,
Yeah.
I've been watching a lot of NDEs on YouTube, and it astonishes me night after night. They're all very similar, but all very different, and it blows my mind. And these are just ordinary people. They're so eloquent, and it's transformed them completely. It's hard to resist the feeling that they're telling the truth.
Yeah, definitely. And it's so widespread. It's so, there's so many universal elements to it. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Gregory Shushan.
Oh, yeah, I know him, yeah.
Yeah, he's done some brilliant work into this, and it really is cross-cultural through history,
right.
and really fascinating phenomenon. Let's talk briefly. I know I haven't got you for too much longer. Let's talk briefly about UFOs, the UFO phenomenon. We've kind of mentioned it a couple of times in passing. Oh, and I don't know how long your story is about Elizabeth, your old student, and the apparition before we move on. I don't know if you wanted to quickly drop that anecdote that you mentioned earlier.
Oh, that was the anecdote about her visiting
your student. The ghost. I think you said there was another anecdote about
right. Okay, I'll begin with that. Let's see. During the time that I knew Elizabeth, she kept telling me that her house was haunted. And I tried, I listened, but she had taken a class of mine. So I would see her often, and she kept me, updated me. So one day, let's see. Oh yes, I wanted to just say a few more things. I thought this ghost I call it the dirty old ghost, because she had two daughters, and this apparition would appear and gape at the girls when they're taking showers. Another story about taking a shower. But so he sounded like an unsavory sort of a character, and I kept telling them to, when you see him, just curse him out. Tell him to scram, you bugger. Don't feel any fear. And then I actually brought a photograph of Padre Pio. And I said, he's a spiritually powerful guy. Just put this up somewhere, and that'll scare him away. What happened that very night, where she put it inside a glass cabinet, no one could get near it. Disappeared. Just vanished.
Really?
Yeah. Well, a while later, I'm trying to remember the setting. I know what happened. Okay. I went to her house to spend the night because she kept telling me about this ghost. She showed me the part of the house where she lived, where it appeared often enough. So I parked myself on a couch and sort of facing this area, hot area where he supposedly appeared. And everybody went to sleep, and I climbed onto my couch and started reading. And I'm in a small room. And suddenly, about 2:00 in the morning, I'm still awake, I hear a gong rings. And I look up on the wall of the room I'm sitting, and there's a gong with a stick, but there's no one in the room but me. So to be sure that sound is related to what I'm seeing, I stand up and I take it off the wall, and I hit it. It's the exact same sound. So I said to myself, I'll be darned. He's here. The ghost let me know that he's here. And then I felt jubilant. And after hitting these gongs, Liz comes downstairs and says, "What's going on?" And I said, "Well, I think your pal is trying to say hello to me." And she said, "Oh, yeah, he does stuff like that." And then she goes back up to sleep. And I figured that was it. And I'm feeling triumphant that I got a definite reaction. I didn't expect anything to happen. So I go back and I start writing this little thing up. And then I look up into the corner that she had indicated was where the dirty-minded ghost liked to appear. And there he was. And what I see was maybe 20 feet away from me in the corner of the room, where I'm lying back on the couch. And what I see is a fluttering, transparent form that is clearly human. And I look at it, and the instant I look at it, it comes straight at me. The fucker wraps itself right around my face and paralyzes me. And I'm trying to cry out, he's here. I can't talk. He's right in front of me. And I'm both totally terrified and totally joyful that I'm being attacked by a ghost.
Because, you could still breathe, right?
Yeah. But it lasted it was very brief. And then gone. He was gone. And I waited till the morning to tell Liz about this, and I've never forgotten. I mean, that was a ghost. Anyone who doubts ghosts, they're real, okay? And so, again, that was a very striking personal experience.
Yeah, I imagine.
But again, it's one form. It involved, it was a physical effect. It was visual. And I think he knew who I was and was trying to scare me out of something, because I was telling them, maybe he didn't, but that's the impression I got. Like he's going to let me know that he's for real and try to terrify me into silence.
That's an incredible experience.
Yeah, it was a striking experience. So I've had, trying to think, I've had so many psychic, I can't remember them all. And they come back. Sometimes I write them up or use them in something I'm writing. But as far as the general point about life after death, there are several different kinds of evidence, and they are all highly suggestive. There is one counter-argument that is valid, that may be valid, and that is the so-called super psi. You've probably heard of that. And I think if you assume an almost infinite capacity of psi to do almost anything like that, you're already in a realm where it's plausible to believe in the separate existence of a psychic personality. But it is remotely conceivable to me. In fact, I recently wrote a post about this. I said, suppose all of the psychic phenomena of suggesting life after death are illusions projected by nature or our subconscious. What's the motivation? What's the point of it? It's very difficult to imagine that this is what is nature?
Because if anything, you'd expect us to need a fear of death, right? And nature would want us to have a fear of death to survive.
And when you're having, for example, a near-death experience, what good is nature doing us by helping to conjure up these illusions? Then you're going to die, and it's not going to have any benefit. You see. So again, I can't swear that we're going to survive. But I won't be surprised, that's how I'll put it, if I find myself still conscious. There's huge amount of evidence, different kinds, and prolonged from the beginning of history. I mean, Fraser wrote a bunch of books about primitive societies, and he found that they had total belief in life after death. Well, partly because they didn't have science to contradict what they were experiencing. But it is interesting that the primitive societies, without fail, are absolutely convinced without any doubt. Now, I know what the critic will say, who wants to say, well, they're ignorant, they don't know about delusions, projection, and all the rest. But I find that a little incredible. And,
absolutely, I'm with you. So yeah, let's, if it's okay with you, just a couple of minutes, your thoughts on UFOs.
Oh,
just I guess to kind of make it easier for you to put it in a nutshell. I guess I'm looking for things like your thoughts on potential origins or what's behind the phenomenon. What if there's an agenda there? Is it a non-human intelligence? Is it something more closer to home? Is it is it something that is there relation to consciousness there? There's so much we could talk about. We could have this conversation for 2 hours, and maybe we will in the future go a deep dive on this. But for now, just your really brief thoughts.
First of all, I am convinced on the basis of my own experience that these entities are real and that they're not from this planet. And my own experience involved a religious theme. Because I was listening to the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost jazz piece, and then after that, then the entity, which was just a cluster of lights, it shot over onto the dome of Our Lady of Pompeii Catholic Church and beamed at us, and then came back to where it was to let us know for sure it was the same entity. Danced around a little bit while the music is going, and then went. In a fraction of a second, I was able to go to the window and watch. It went zip, 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 and vanished over the Empire State Building in a fraction of a second. So that's nothing terrestrial there. That's and tons of other evidence. I mean, the top-notch pilots of the leading aircraft, fighter jets. I've watched them and read their experiences that these entities, whatever they are technologically beyond us, completely beyond us. So it's not just my experience. Where they come from, I get the sense that there are a multiplicity of types that are visiting us.
Yeah.
Not all of them are nice. There are some nasty. I have upstairs 2 or 3 shelves of books just on UFOs that I've been collecting for the past half century. And they are around in all shapes and forms. But I do think that some of the main reasons they're around right now, and especially since 1947, is the fact that we have invented weapons of mass destruction in which it is now possible for one man to press a button and launch a process that will bring life on Earth to an end, an atomic war. And I think that's why they're here, and are more explicit. And I think that they seem to support religion as perhaps as a source of morality, inspiration for morality. Not that they are themselves, but it is, I have to admit, it's puzzling. Visions of Mary, for example, in 1917, Fatima. Jacques Vallée wrote beautiful analysis of what happened.
The Miracle of the Sun.
And there's no doubt that the phenomenology of UFOs was mixed with the phenomenology of the Virgin appearing to these 3 children. And then what happened with the sun, the dance of the sun? The sun didn't dance. If the sun danced, it would be toast, the end of life on Earth. That's absurd. Yeah. But naive Catholics still believe the sun danced, you see. It didn't dance. What happened was a UFO created the illusion, and it scared the crap out of everybody. And, the ground had just been raining violently. And after that game that the entities played with the sun, everything dried up. It was seen 30 miles away. People were healed. It's one of the most amazing paranormal phenomena in the whole of history, and it closely related to UFOs. Yeah, so it's very mysterious, the UFO phenomenon. It's again, morally speaking, there are two dimensions, I think. One positive and constructive, and the other rather distressingly dangerous, I think. Um, but the phenomena are real. I mean, there is no question about it. And, uh, 1952 was right over Washington, D.C. I mean, I wasn't watching it or anything like that, but just a child. But anyway, yeah, I don't know what else I can say. It's a big mystery, but it's absolutely real and incredibly fascinating. I'm amazed that more people, mainstream folks, are not talking about it.
I know, especially, scientists and people that are supposed to be intrigued on the cutting edge and looking at new things. I am. It's wild. I do think it's about to catch the public's attention on a larger scale with, I don't know if you've been keeping up with David Grush and the latest whistleblowers and all the news.
It is.
So I do think it's going to unfold.
Yeah.
And what you were saying about how bizarre it is, I think there seems to be that kind of trickster element that seems to show up a lot in the areas of psi and even looking into survival after death. Mm-hmm. There's always this consistent theme of, oh, you think you're getting a handle on this? No, you're not, because you just throw a spanner in the works. Absolutely. And curveballs. You said you think, so not human. Would you speculate as to whether you think it's something you did kind of mention multiple dimensions. So would you be more on the side of, interdimensional than extraplanetary?
Yeah, I have my doubts about, one or two things. Either science is so evolved and perhaps maybe thousands of years that they can just zap around the universe. The other is, and I'm not even sure what the difference would be in making this point, but we often hear of many people talk about another dimension. And see, that would, in a sense, solve the problem of distance. Surely it's hard to believe that something traveled, thousands of light years to come to Greenwich Village and dance with me and John Coltrane's music. I mean, but if they are, and by the way, I forgot to mention, whatever it was, had to know what we were doing. I mean, we didn't have a sign out on the roof. We're listening to John Coltrane, right? We were listening to John Coltrane, and with that religious title. But it's a complete mystery, the UFO phenomenon. Yeah. And there's an overlap with the paranormal because it's lots of stories of levitation. And all the communications with these entities is said to occur telepathically. So already you have to have a connection there between the two.
Yeah.
And, our scientific evolution is just very primitive compared to what is possible. Imagine a scientific culture that's 1,000 years old, unlike our couple of 100 years old. Who knows?
I know.
That's exciting.
You just, it's. I love thinking like this. That how many civilizations are out there that are, as you say, 1,000 or 10,000 or 250,000 or 1,000,000 years older than us. The possibilities are. We probably don't even have the imagination necessarily to be able to think.
Exactly. One of the things I thought that I like to share, just as science evolves, we're getting to understand the unbelievable, unthinkable vastness of the universe. Same thing is happening with the mind. The more we learn about the mind, the more complex, the richer, the more far out it becomes. So, happy evolution, humanity. We've got a lot to learn. But in the meantime, we are facing a climate catastrophe, and the threat of nuclear war is now heightened. And we have people, even in the United States, that are, I think, crazy, completely crazy, people out of touch with reality. And I recently came across some UFO story about that I didn't know, that the military is filled with Christian fundamentalists, and they want to bury they don't want to talk about the UFOs.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that until recently.
Yeah, because I think they think they're demonic, right? They
exactly
that's what they believe,
and that stands in the way of of science,
progress.
of progress, of understanding. So, yeah, it's what a strange time to be alive.
Really, it is, isn't it? You couldn't write this.
It's kind of thrilling just to be alive in the 21st century, because day in and day out things are happening. I have a little notebook where I facts that are so bizarre, and I've forgotten. I write them down, and there's so many strange things that I've never thought of or heard of every day. Some of them are just funny and weird. Others are have implications that are dizzying. Yeah. So, what can we say?
I'd like to read that notepad at some point.
No.
No, look, this has been so fascinating. You've been so generous with your time, Michael. I could talk to you for hours. This has been brilliant. Before I let you go, are there any last words you want to share with people that have watched and listened? Any kind of message you want to send to anyone?
Well, I think learning about the mind and its potentialities, and not to be afraid, and don't think that don't be intimidated by people who want to make short shrift of your interest in the extraordinary and the unusual, because we are immersed in the extraordinary and the unusual. Explore. We have great opportunities for the future to evolve and learn and hopefully survive as a species.
Yeah, hopefully.
That's about all I would
explore.
Say.
I love it. It's valuable. Explore. Yeah. Thank you again, Michael, so much. I really appreciate this, and I wish you all my best. I look forward to doing it again.
All right. Take care. I enjoyed it myself.
Thank you to Michael Grosso for talking with me. Thank you for listening, and thank you to our patrons for helping to make it possible. Please see the description for links to Michael's books and more. If you enjoyed the interview, please consider subscribing to continue unraveling the universe with us. If you'd like to help us keep making content, you can contribute monthly via Patreon. Thank you.